If it's Thursday, paying the price, the U.S. is warned that its credit rating will be downgraded if Washington can't get its act together as the president touts progress in talks. Behind the scenes, with just 1 week until a potential government default. Plus, failure to launch. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis tries to steady the ship after a bumpy and botched entrance into the Republican presidential campaign as former President Trump expands his lead on the field. And the future of AI, my one-on-one exclusive interview with the president of Microsoft as Washington looks to rein in the rapidly evolving technology before it's too late. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd reporting from Washington, where White House and congressional negotiators have still not yet hammered out a deal to raise the nation's borrowing limit, which is 7 days until a potential government default based on Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's calendar. Negotiators on Capitol Hill haven't hit the panic button yet, though. They say a deal could be within reach soon. They could take the weekend. But even if that does happen, we're already seeing some political and economic fallout. The White House appears to be losing the messaging war against Republicans over the debt ceiling. A couple of new polls indicate that. Here's one from Fox. A majority of Americans, 57%, agree with the Republican position in these talks that Congress should raise the debt ceiling only if spending is cut. And if you want to dismiss that poll because it's Fox, well, let me show you these numbers from a CNN poll. They're basically identical. They found 60% of Americans supporting spending cuts in exchange for raising the debt ceiling. By the way, the president's approval rating fell to just 40% in that poll. With numbers like that, it is perhaps no wonder that we're seeing some Democrats voice their frustration and angst over the White House strategy. Amid that scrutiny, the president addressed the ongoing negotiations from the White House earlier this afternoon.
I've made clear time and again defaulting on our national debt is not an option. The American people deserve to know that the Social Security payments will be there, the Veterans Hospitals remain open, and that economic progress will be made, and we're going to continue to make it. Default puts all that at risk. Congressional leaders understand that, and they've all agreed there will be no default. And it's time for Congress to act now.
Meanwhile, a number of Democrats privately and publicly have urged the president to stand his ground as Republicans push for across-the-board cuts to various government programs. Today, the top Democrat in the House, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, appeared to send a message to his caucus in an attempt to allay their growing concerns.
It's clear to me that President Biden is continuing to hold the line as it relates to the types of devastating cuts that Republicans are trying to jam down the throats of the American people, including making sure that he stands up for our veterans. President Biden engaged with House Republicans at the earliest opportunity. It's important for everyone to accurately lock in on the actual timeline.
As for negotiations, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and the president say progress is being made. One of McCarthy's top negotiators told reporters today there is hope for a breakthrough before it's too late.
I think we've been close for 6 or 7 days. The issues are thorny. They're difficult. There is the will to get a deal. Everybody's trying to do a fine job of figuring out the finer details of this, but nothing's done. And we're at a sensitive phase with sensitive issues that remain. Those sensitive issues are the thorniest issues that we've been discussing.
Adding to the anxiety in Washington and on Wall Street, Fitch, one of the country's 3 major credit rating agencies, warned it might downgrade the country's credit rating, citing political brinksmanship and reduced financing flexibility. The last time a downgrade happened after a similar standoff over the debt ceiling in 2011, the stock market took a $1 trillion-sized hit. Joining me now is NBC senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell and NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale. Kelly, you and I have done this a lot. And today is one of those days where I'm very optimistic. I see Chip Roy talking about not liking anything McCarthy's about to do. And I see the head of the Congressional Black Caucus saying Joe Biden needs to speak to the nation and hold Republicans accountable. That tells me we're close. I know that seems a weird way to say that. Kind of tells me we're close, no?
Well, it feels like there is a real sense that a deal is within the grasp of the negotiators. At the same time, as Congressman McHenry pointed out, until all of the elements are resolved and settled, you can't count on any piece of it being done. So there is a mood of wanting to get something resolved. However, there are those outside forces like the threat of a downgrade that are putting some additional pressure. It's a point in time where when you look at what the Speaker is saying, that he will not give a shortcut to passing a bill more quickly, we're running out of time for those steps to be taken once there would be a deal achieved. So there is sort of a frustration across the political spectrum about how this has been going, about some of the issues on the table. And I guess that sense gives us some idea of the ultimate outcome should it happen, where not everyone will be happy. And that is a way to get to a deal. Now, of course, they could have done budget as an entirely separate matter through the normal, ordinary process of negotiating in the House. This is a push where the Republicans have tied budget issues to the debt ceiling. Those don't always have to be interlinked. So there is certainly some pressure on the White House. They are saying they want to give room for these negotiations to go forward. So we've heard from the president, but we've not heard from him as often as we've heard from the Speaker and other members of the Republican conference.
Kelly, I'm just curious, behind the scenes, we've seen two polls that are almost identical, one from Fox, one from CNN. And I know there are some that say, oh, this is not the right way to ask this question. Okay, but this is how the public seems to be consuming this. How does the White House, taking the fact that majorities in two different polls are taking the Republican side of this argument, which says the debt ceiling should only be raised with spending cuts?
Well, there's frustration, and I think there is an argument to be made. Has the White House told its story in the most effective way? Because Republicans have been, on a daily basis, putting this in the context of how ordinary people live their lives. They've got a budget to meet, to pay the bills at home, whether it's mortgage, rent, groceries, whatever it may be, and that you can't just keep spending. That can be very persuasive to many Americans as they compare it to their own lives. At the same time, the White House would argue that threatening important programs that people rely on will be disastrous and will have a real impact on Americans' lives. So the idea of how much do people understand this debate as it's playing out? You can argue that the American people know very well what's at stake here. And at the same time, you can have people who say that the way you look at this really comes down to very strong feelings about, is government working for you or not working for you? And that's a real debate right now.
Let me move over to Ali Vitale. Ali, on Capitol Hill, I've noticed there's grumbling on the right. I noted this to Kelly. There's grumbling on the left. But here's the question I have for you specifically about Speaker McCarthy. He's won the PR battle, if you believe these polling. Yeah. Does he know how to land this? Can he do this? I mean, because he's going to have to keep the Freedom Caucus at bay if the votes are going to be there. I think he knows that. I don't know if the Freedom Caucus knows that yet. Can he land this plane?
I think the Freedom Caucus is aware, but I don't know that they've come to terms with that yet. I mean, even just as I was walking over to come talk with you guys, Chip Roy was going back into McCarthy's office. And after having spoken to him this morning, it doesn't sound like anything that Roy or any of his colleagues in the Freedom Caucus want in this is actually going to come out in this bill. But what I said to him is the same thing that you and I have talked about here before. Were you going to vote for anything that was bipartisanly negotiated? And he didn't say no, but I think all of us who watch this and track this know that the most conservative members of the Republican conference were never really going to get on board with something like this. Now, here's the question, though. You can cover, the 30 or 40 votes that you lose on the ultra-conservative side of the spectrum with moderate Democrats coming in to vote for this. But I have heard from Democrats who are grumbling around the idea that this is something that they will need to be whipped on. They're going to need to see the details on this. If Republicans are in the dark, which by and large they are, Democrats certainly are in terms of where the things are in the room on this. Our understanding is that they are apart right now based on still talking about spending. They're still far apart on that. When you're talking about these issues as thorny, this has been the through line over the course of the last few weeks, that they have been in the hard-knuckle negotiating phase of this. So I think that there's progress in the room, but they're clearly still not in a place where they're ready to come out and release this. I do think the other thing that we need to focus on here, though, too, when you talk about the timing, and I think my concern here was always that people accidentally stumble into a default, because both sides agree that you shouldn't have one, but they're not working expeditiously enough to do it. It's important to understand that when the House rules say you need 72 hours between getting the bill and being able to vote on the bill, the clock starts when they file it. So as soon as text comes out, that clock starts, and then that's nothing to say for the Senate side of this, but at least we understand the House mechanics there.
Right, but all those rules are, I'm sorry, they're not, they're Kelly knows this, we've done this. All those rules matter until they don't.
Exactly.
I am curious, though, if the Fitch news, the idea of a downgrade, did that move anybody, Allie?
I don't think so. I mean, the people who were dug in on hating this deal still kind of hate this deal. I think for Democrats, it was another reminder. I think more of them started looking at their calendars on their phones or their watches, being like, are y'all aware of where we are on the calendar right now?
Right.
I do think that when you hear from, and we've rightly focused on the House side of this, because that's where the action is, especially on the Republican side. But the concern is that when you see people like Senator Mike Lee saying that he's going to gum up the process when you get to the Senate side of this, that even further elongates this. And I think that could get some people concerned.
Kelly O'Donnell from the White House, Ali Vitale on Capitol Hill, thank you both. So joining me now is John Chambers, who served as head of sovereign ratings for S&P when it downgraded the U.S.'s credit rating in 2011. Mr. Chambers, I appreciate you doing this. So let me start with explaining what goes into a decision to downgrade, specifically 2011. The U.S. credit rating was downgraded. For how long were we downgraded before it got elevated again?
Well, it hasn't been elevated. At Standard & Poor's, the rating is still AA+. So you've got 12 years that have elapsed. Other sovereigns that had a AAA that have regained it, of which there are a handful, took over a decade on average. And the downgrade was motivated by two factors. One was the very divisive political environment that we had that was highlighted by the impasse over the debt ceiling. And the second was the fiscal trajectory. And I think that what we're seeing now validates the decision back then to have lowered the rating, because we are confronting the same problems we have now. So you see, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, not only does it look like we have the same problems now, but we seem more polarized, and the trajectory seems worse. So should we be prepared for another downgrade, no matter what happens, even if we don't breach the debt ceiling? Well,
I'm retired now, but in my opinion, the situation is much worse. You had a failed coup d'etat 2 years ago. The debt is much higher than we projected at the time. When you look at the debt of both the federal government and the states combined. And here, right now, we have a path to default, which most of us, including me, believe will not take place. But still, you can see how it could take place within a week. And that is not consistent with the AAA rating, and I think that's what Fitch is signaling to us today.
You just heard from my report that the Fitch signal, the bat signal, if you will, didn't move anybody. Maybe the markets dropping thousands of points would move folks. Are you surprised markets haven't reacted yet, or are they almost, have we boiled that frog, if you will?
Well, some of the markets have reacted. If you look at the Treasury bill that's for the June maturities, it's costing 50 basis points more than the July bill. So clearly there's some dislocation there. But I promise you that if there's a default or even a sequestration of ordinary payments, this is going to be Lehman on steroids. You're going to have disruptions in the money markets, in the capital markets, in the FX markets. It's going to be quite severe.
Explain to my viewers here how much this costs the government, right? If we lower our credit rating, it means our borrowing costs go up, which means we're going to accelerate our debt issue, no?
there is a correlation between ratings and what you pay for your debt. But regardless of what the ratings do, I think that market participants are going to insist on a premium to buy U.S. government debt if they're not 100% sure that they're going to get paid on time. Now, all of this is not to say that a fiscal correction isn't necessary. A fiscal correction is necessary, but this is not the way to do it. These deficits and the past debt have been approved by Congress, and to separate the budget process from the debt approval process is unique among the 130 sovereigns that I used to rate.
When you compare us to other countries, AA+, does it still put us at the top or not?
Well, AA+, you've got a dozen countries that have a AAA rating. So no, they're not at the top. And if you look at credit default swaps, you'll see that you've got 10 or 12 countries that pay less for their credit default swaps than the United States.
So if you could talk to some of these members of Congress, because I'll be honest with you, sometimes it feels as if they don't quite understand the matches they're playing with right now and the lethal nature of that propane.
Well, I used to talk with them, and most of the staffers understand, but the politicians have their own agenda to try to advance, and I think that's probably where the problem lies. It's really quite irresponsible.
And what you're saying is to recover this downgrade, at best, we're looking at a decade.
I'm saying for the investors at large to perceive the United States as the preeminent credit in any strength. It has the largest economy, education, it has the reserve currency,
right.
It's got the strongest banking system and deepest capital markets in the world. It's got to fix two problems. One is it's got to fix its governance problems, which is going to take work on both sides of the aisle. The second problem it's going to have to fix is its fiscal trajectory. It's one thing to run deficits during a recession. Everyone agrees that that is appropriate. But during good times, or at least during normal times, you have to at least run a primary fiscal balance, which means a balance of your receipts and your expenditures before interest payments in order to stabilize the debt over time. And we're not close to that right now.
Well, I would argue those two issues you just pointed out are related. The governance, without good governance, you're not going to have the conversations about how to deal with the debt trajectory, that's for sure. John Chambers, who had done this for a living for years, knows this up and down. It's really good to have an expert on here on these downgrades and what they mean. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chuck.
Coming up,
Chuck.
DeSantis' very bumpy start. The presidential candidate is facing the fallout after his campaign launch was marred by technical difficulties. Ended up being mocked by his Republican rivals. The reaction, what it means, panel's next. Plus, with great power comes great responsibility. My one-on-one interview with a top Microsoft executive as the tech titan wrestles with the potential promise and profitability and peril of AI technology. Remember, Microsoft, the biggest investor behind ChatGPT. I'll talk to him. That's ahead. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis stumbled into the 2024 race last night as his much-anticipated Twitter Spaces launch with CEO Elon Musk was plagued by technical difficulties and frustration that was captured on hot mics. DeSantis did eventually deliver his scripted announcement, and his team tried to downplay the mishap, claiming they broke the internet. Here's how DeSantis handled an interview on Fox last night.
We had a huge audience. It was the biggest they'd ever had. It did break the Twitter space. And so we're really excited with the enthusiasm. But ultimately, it's about the future of our country. Trey, I'm running to lead a great American comeback.
DeSantis' opponents are reveling in the rollout. In a flurry of posts on his own social media platform, Donald Trump called the launch a disaster and a catastrophe, adding, "I know, Ron, the way he handled his announcement, he will handle the country." Before last night's stumbles, DeSantis was already facing an uphill climb for this nomination. He trails Trump by more than 20 points across 4 different polls that we saw released this week. And today, Trump picked off another endorsement in Florida from Congressman Daniel Webster. Former president has now racked up 12 endorsements just from Florida congressional Republicans, while the Florida governor has just 1. So how important is that moment last night? Joining me is our panel, Eugene Scott, senior politics reporter at Axios, Simone Sanders-Townsend, the former advisor to Vice President Harris, host of Simone on MSNBC, and Brendan Buck, former advisor to Speakers John Boehner and Paul Ryan. Here's one thing I think we know for sure, Eugene, is that no matter what happens to the DeSantis presidential campaign, if he's taken the oath of office up there on January 20, 2025, or if he doesn't make it to Iowa, the Twitter announcement will be the first sentence of the campaign, right? Either he overcame it or it was a metaphor for the disaster. That's fair?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that people will be talking about for a while. It's going
to leave a mark.
Yeah, but not even the mark on some of the people he needs to reach. Like, first of all, there are a lot of people not on Twitter who he needs to vote for him, especially outside of his tribe. And choosing this way to connect with people or make this very important announcement could signal to them that he's not really interested in talking to them, something that people already think about DeSantis based on his policies and the positions he's taken.
Simone, you've been on presidential campaigns. Talk about announcements.
This was wild.
Just the announcement. But
yeah,
do you ever cede control? Talk about how campaigns, how often do you see them cede control of announcement day to another entity?
You don't, because there are very few big stages you get on any campaign, but especially a presidential campaign, where you have the most eyeballs and the attention. Your announcement day is one of them. I would argue the first debate is one of those, and then those are the only 2 things you're guaranteed. If you get to the general election, it is the day you name your running mate. Again, biggest stages. And so because of that, this is your opportunity to introduce yourself to America, to the voters. And although Ron DeSantis has high name ID, right, governor of Florida, you cannot assume everyone knows you. Bio is very important. That's what a speech should do. Now, I don't agree with a lot of the things that, for instance, were in Tim Scott's speech, but Tim Scott had a good announcement. He gave a little bio. He gave you a little background. If you didn't know much about Tim Scott, you walked away from his announcement knowing more if you saw clips and pieces of it. The other important part of an announcement for a presidential campaign is you obviously want to raise some money, okay? You want to raise money so that people see you. How do people see you? You put out a nice video, you have a nice speech, and then on network television, on cable television, and on local television, they run the B-roll, they run the clips from your speech of you looking presidential and people behind you waving American flags. Yay, America. There was not much of that. Even Ron DeSantis' video, which I was glad to see that the campaign did think enough to have a visual component, it was just him walking, talking. There was no interaction of him with individuals. He has been out here on the campaign trail, but not the campaign trail, for a number of weeks now, prior to officially announcing. So there was opportunity to have video or pictures of him interacting with real people, talking about why he's running for them. I think that this is a campaign that seems very online, playing to what the media apparatus is saying, what folks are saying on social media, and that is not real life.
Brendan, I will say one thing, and then I want you to chime in on all the different ways you want to chime in. But we all know how Washington works. We're almost at 24 hours since this debacle. Yeah. If the idea of Elon Musk and Twitter Spaces and Ron DeSantis was the idea of some campaign staffer or strategist, the tire tracks on that person would already be visible, and we know who it is. This has the sneaking suspicion of a candidate idea.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, you should hire Simone.
Unfortunately, I'm unavailable.
Look, I think the problem for Ron DeSantis at this point is that there's kind of a narrative forming that maybe he's not so good at this stuff. Yeah. And he's had a number of missteps. Every time he seemed to have popped up in the last several months, it's been for bad things, whether it's Ukraine or Disney or whatever it is. And one of the most dangerous things in politics is a narrative getting set, because it becomes self-reinforcing.
Unless you're Donald Trump.
Well, certainly. But everything sort of feeds on itself, and all of a sudden, every time you do something, it's like, oh, there goes Ron DeSantis again, screwing something up. And that may catch hold if he doesn't turn it around pretty quick.
Which is the point Trump made in his tweet, right? That this person who can't even lay out an announcement, how can he run this country?
But I want to say, the louder somebody talks, the more you got to acknowledge they're nervous. Donald Trump obsesses over Ron DeSantis right now.
Yeah, I mean, he absolutely does seem nervous.
Let's not pretend DeSantis, all of these problems, there's no doubt. It still rattles Trump.
Yeah, which is why I think more likely than not, Donald Trump will show up on at least a few of the debate stages as we get closer to January 2024. Because remember, Iowa caucuses are January 8th. That's when the Iowa voters go to their caucuses, i.e. their polls. Look, I think again, we've talked about this. Is it early? Is it late? We're right in the middle in that sweet spot. I think we have to see these candidates out on the campaign trail. The polls that you put up and showed, these are still national polls. There's some, we haven't seen, I would argue, very great polling yet coming out of Iowa, New Hampshire, or South Carolina.
These numbers have dipped, but not as badly.
Exactly.
From my understanding, just not as badly.
And so those are the numbers that matter. How are voters responding to each and every one of these candidates? Remains to be seen.
Is there a chicken salad to be made out of this, Brendan? And does he know how to do it?
Yeah, that's the question. Is he actually good at politics? And so, like, that's the ultimate question I have with Ron DeSantis now. Look, he got reelected by like 19 points in the state of Florida. Like, that's not nothing. But a lot of that was just built off of how he made a bet on COVID, and it played off.
Yeah,
it paid off. Yeah. I mean, that worked out well for him. Whether or not he's actually...
I got a bet on the Heat winning the Eastern Conference Finals. I put down a month and a half ago. I'm hoping that bet pays off.
Yeah, but whether or not he's agile enough and talented enough to navigate some of these things, well, look, I think Donald Trump certainly worries about Ron DeSantis, but he doesn't just worry. He goes on the attack. And I think that's one of the reasons why you've seen Donald Trump's numbers go up and Ron DeSantis' numbers go down, is because he takes swings at him. And Ron DeSantis has yet demonstrated that he knows not only how to take the punch, but to throw one back and put some points on the board against Donald Trump. And until he figures that out, he's going to remain far, far behind.
Sometimes I wonder if Trump is mostly worried about DeSantis, or if he's just angry and offended by DeSantis. You know, it could be.
Or is he just going after who's ever number two?
Yeah, right.
This is a campaign. That's what you should do.
That's right.
Yeah.
He's going after everybody else. No one seems to want to go after Donald Trump, but Donald Trump's happy to take swings at
And
all
he
the other
understands the
candidates.
media narrative.
All the other yes, he does.
Yeah.
Well, this to me, Eugene, is DeSantis' biggest problem. If you have progressive Twitter and MAGA Twitter all piling on DeSantis, that's an ugly day.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's much of a DeSantis Twitter. I mean, we see people defending him who seem to want something Trumpy, but an alternative, but they aren't the loudest voices, and they aren't controlling the narrative, and he's not really giving them new material to show them why he could be better than what, you know, is currently being said of him.
Let me pivot to the debt ceiling. Simone, we have two polls that indicate the White House has lost the messaging war here. How'd that happen?
I don't even think we needed the polls to know. Just ask the people up on Capitol Hill. Look, I think it happened because this was this was a complicated issue, and at the beginning, all you heard from the White House a consistent message: the president is not going to negotiate on the debt ceiling. He will talk about the budget. He will not talk about the debt ceiling. These without forcing Speaker McCarthy to put his budget on the table. You are negotiating on the debt ceiling, and without being able to pass a clean debt ceiling. Without talking about the budget, you are negotiating on the debt ceiling. And so I think such forceful language on the front end, it's what they believed. I'm pretty sure it was, but obviously it wasn't a strategy that they could hold to. And so the pivot now is, well, the media apparatus does not understand the stakes.
The media's fault.
And it is not being framed correctly. And I think it is actually being framed quite accurately. I think the only misstep, if you will, that the media apparatus had is giving Kevin McCarthy so much credit for barely passing his debt ceiling bill, because now there's no even guarantee that he has the votes to, even if folks agree on the negotiation.
But Brendan, the real test is, you've heard the Chip Roy stuff, right? You're hearing the Byron Donalds stuff, and they're not going to vote for McCarthy's deal. Will McCarthy survive? I mean, can he land this? He's won the messaging war. And I know he's trying to tell, hey, guys, look, I got him to the table. We're winning politically. And I heard Byron Donalds say, I don't care that we're winning politically. I want to make an impact. Can he land this?
This whole process could not have gone better for Kevin McCarthy, where everyone is playing Kevin McCarthy's game. He's winning the PR game, but we also always just end up in the same spot no matter what. It's almost like none of that matters. We have a bipartisan deal and nobody's going to like it. And look, he starts off from a really strong position. Like, there were not a lot of people making veiled threats about him going into this. Like, they've all been sticking by him. I'm much more concerned now, though, about his ability to pass it and to get a majority of the majority. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. That is the mantra of that conference. You need a majority of House Republicans to vote for it, and it's going to be tight.
Eugene, I played a clip of Hakeem Jeffries. I've spent a lot of time with Hakeem Jeffries, on the record, off the record. I never heard a more unenthusiastic Hakeem Jeffries trying to sell, hey, guys, here's this chicken salad. We're not going to cut veterans' benefits.
Yeah, I was at that conference, and he made it very clear, you know, where he stands and what he thinks Democrats value and what he hopes will not happen. But the reality is, he doesn't know what this agreement is going to be yet. And
Is there going to be a majority of House Democrats having to bring this across the finish line? I mean,
they should have spent more time trying to get the 5 Republicans on board with them for a discharge petition. I think that's my Monday morning quarterback analysis.
Brendan, I mean, I don't mean to, I'm going to get in trouble here, but could a majority of Republicans, are there a majority of, I mean, I think this deal has to have a majority of Republicans.
Oh, I mean, that's what Kevin McCarthy, but I'm not sure they will. Kevin McCarthy is projecting a lot of confidence that he will be able to. I think that will be very difficult to do.
If the Democrats have to deliver more votes for Kevin McCarthy's deal, I don't want to be at the next lunch between Hakeem Jeffries and Joe Biden. Anyway, Eugene, Simone, and Brendan, thank you. Up next, my exclusive interview with Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, as the multi-billion-dollar company plunges headfirst into the brave new world of artificial intelligence. But he's here in Washington because he says, regulate us. He's ready for regulation. Hear his version of it. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As new AI technology and chatbots like ChatGPT explode onto the scene, here in the nation's capital, lawmakers are grappling with how to keep up. In recent weeks, tech executives and AI leaders have been descending on Washington, testifying on the Hill, meeting with the White House, even having off the records with members of the press as they try to shape future regulations. Earlier today, I had a chance to sit down with Microsoft Vice Chair and President Brad Smith in an exclusive interview about the future challenges and opportunities of AI, how to regulate this rapidly evolving technology. Here's some of our conversation. Is this an Oppenheimer moment? Meaning, you know, we had this amazing, incredible, powerful technology with nuclear that was ahead of where government could figure out how are we going to regulate this, and we came up. What should be the model as we tackle artificial intelligence? Is it sort of the way we tackled nuclear?
I think it's a great question, but I would really say the answer is almost the opposite. Humanity invented or tamed the atom to create a bomb that could destroy people, and later on figured that they could tame the atom to produce power as well. OpenAI is creating artificial intelligence to do good, and yet we also need to think about how it can be misused and do harm. But let's at least start with, we're doing this for a good reason. Let's protect against the abuse. We're not doing it to create a weapon in the first place.
All right. But we just released it into the public before we had guardrails. And that seems to be a bit disturbing because the last experiment we did on the population was social media. We released it with our guardrails. And after a few years, we realized, oh, that was a mistake. Do you at all regret that ChatGPT is public right now?
No, but I would first embrace the premise, if you will.
Okay.
We need guardrails. And we need guardrails that are built by companies, and then we need guardrails that are in the law and are supervised by governments. In the case of ChatGPT, or really GPT-4, call it, the model itself, there is a deployment safety board that's managed by OpenAI and Microsoft.
Who's on that board? Who makes up that board?
It's people who are...
What are their backgrounds? Tell me their backgrounds. Are they engineers?
It is fundamentally engineers, but they are engineers with a broad perspective on life.
So, if you were to ask Congress to act now, it's going to be tough to get this Congress to do this. What's the first regulation you think should be put on all of you right now?
Well, we're really asking for two things, and it's why I've come to Washington this week. The first is we're asking the executive branch to move forward with an executive order so that it will only purchase or procure AI services in certain categories from companies that are applying an AI risk management framework that's been adopted by the government itself, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Let's send a signal to the market.
Do they have that framework yet?
Yes, it was released in January, and actually it resulted from 18 months of work pursuant to a law that Congress passed in 2020. So that, we should say, is that's good news. But then second, we are going to need another law. And I think what we're going to need is a new agency that is responsible for deciding when these most powerful models will be licensed, do it pursuant to safety requirements.
Do you think we need like a commission? We have the nuclear, the reason I started with Oppenheimer
is
we have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Is that a model?
I think we should look to those kinds of models. We have a Federal Aviation Administration. We have a Food and Drug Administration. If you buy a product in the grocery store, then go next door to the pharmacy, get in your car, and then go to the airport, every step of the way, you are getting a product that has been reviewed and to some degree is regulated by the government. It's okay for all of us from the tech sector to say, you know what? Innovation flourishes. People have confidence in what they buy. There is a role for balanced regulation, and that is what we're going to need from Congress.
What responsibility do you think Microsoft has, regardless your sort of morality and ethical responsibility here? Because that's not something you can legislate.
I think we do and always will have the first responsibility to get this right. I mean, I do not for a moment think it's ever appropriate for a tech company to say, we're waiting for the government to tell us what to do, and until they do, we're not going to think about these hard questions. We need to think about them. And we've been preparing for this moment for 6 years. We adopted 6 ethical principles. We have corporate policies. We have testing. We have training. We have tooling. We have an oversight mechanism. We better get it right just about every day.
This is the week that we had the Surgeon General put out a warning about social media. Okay, and there's been a lot of, look, I absolutely believe some of this stuff is an addiction for some people. I think some people know how to not be addicted to things, and some people do. And like tobacco, like cigarette smoking, there's something to it. But this gets at the heart of sort of skepticism here, which is the social media companies let us down. Why should we trust you guys on AI?
I sort of go back to the famous phrase from Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. Let's all learn from the past, whether we were responsible for it or not. And frankly, it's a lot easier to learn from other people's mistakes than from your own. Right. Let's learn, let's be responsible, but let's have the government play an appropriate role to supervise, in effect, the things that we're the most worried about, and let's do it from the get-go rather than wait for things to go off the rails.
There have been a lot of your sort of tech competitors and colleagues who've also come to Washington over the last month. Everybody's trying to shape this conversation. Some of the Google engineers are a little more nervous about where things are going than, say, some of the Meta engineers who think that this is headed in a certain place. And certainly ChatGPT CEO came in here and said, hey, regulate us, do this. The Google engineers seem to be worried about that moment that the machines could take over. What is the level of concern you have on that?
I think we should be concerned if we fail to address the problem. So let's start by defining the problem. In that case, I think the problem is defined as, look, we don't want machines to start running critical infrastructure and going
They're already
awry.
deciding health outcomes, some healthcare outcomes, and that's mostly good, but when it's an insurance company using AI to decide a claim is, we're going to pay for this claim and not that claim, suddenly that feels like a machine deciding my healthcare.
And it raises 2 really important points. First, let's all recognize the law applies. There is no defense called, Your Honor, a machine made me do this.
Right.
People. We, the insurance company.
So Microsoft, in this case, if you build the AI platform that does this, you're comfortable being liable if it's misused.
I think what one needs to do when it comes to liability questions is look at where the control and the decisions are being made. In some cases, it may be the company that makes the model. In some cases, it may be the company that has the infrastructure where it's being deployed. In that case, it might be the insurance company itself. Right. It needs to be accountable for ensuring that humans are taking the output from a computer and using their brain. Let's not stop thinking here. That's why we have fundamentally taken every service that we're creating and calling it a co-pilot. Let's not put our brains on autopilot. Let's use this to get smarter and learn faster.
What's something that you think Congress could do in the moment, right now? Like a simple thing early?
I would love to see the Congress move forward with a piece of legislation that frankly would create a new regulatory agency and give it the authority to get to work.
So get it out of the no FTC offshoot, no CISA offshoot, do this separate, create a new agency.
Yes.
Okay.
And that can be done. I mean, here in Washington, people say, oh, no, we did that last century.
We create alphabet soups all the time.
Yeah, it can be done, and then give it the authority pursuant to legislative oversight, but and direct the agency as to the goals and the roles it should play, but let it get into the details.
The future of Microsoft, how important is AI to it?
I think AI is important to the future of every aspect of digital technology. So I think it's of fundamental importance to the future of Microsoft.
So it's sort of like it's the equivalent of sort of like if the internet is foundational, AI is foundational now to every tech company.
I think it probably is. In fact, I'd almost go as far as to say AI will become important to every company, regardless of the fields it's in.
There's a real sense. There's some lawmakers that would love to just hit pause. Come on, let's figure out the guardrails before we go full bore into this. Everything I've learned says, well, this is out, the toothpaste is out of the tube. Is it, or is there a way to slow things down?
I fundamentally think it's extraordinarily difficult, especially in the world that we live in today, with different countries, different approaches, China, the United States, elsewhere, to slow the pace of technology. What we can do.
Some would argue that that's in your business interest to not slow the pace, for what it's worth.
Yeah,
right.
I'm not going to contest that. We believe in innovation moving forward. Let's accelerate the pace of, I'll call it, responsibility. Self-responsibility, self-governance, but governance under the law by the government. That's where we should speed up.
We got a lot more that we got into, more specifics, if you will, on who should decide how AI works. You can catch my full interview with Brad Smith on MeetThePress.com and YouTube right now. After the break, behind bars, the founder of the far-right Oath Keepers has been sentenced to 18 years in prison for his role in the January 6th attack. We'll have the details next. You're watching Meet the Press now.
For today, I have the honor of introducing my nominee to be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Charles Q. Brown, Jr. General, welcome. Over the past 3 years, as Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Brown has become known for his signature approach: accelerate, change, or lose.
Welcome back. We had a couple of important and significant events happen today in Washington. That was President Biden announcing that Air Force General Charles C.Q. Brown is his choice to succeed General Mark Milley as the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the most senior military role in the country. If he is confirmed by the Senate, General Brown would become only the second African-American man to hold that position. Of course, the first was Colin Powell. A confirmation could also be historic in its own right, since it could be the first time in American history both the Pentagon's top military and civilian officials would be black men. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has served since the beginning of the Biden administration. But I should tell you, Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville has a hold on all military appointments right now before the Senate, and this falls under that category, so this could be held up for a while. And in another historic development in D.C. today, Stuart Rhodes, who's the founder of the far-right extremist group called the Oath Keepers, was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison on seditious conspiracy charges in connection with his role in January 6th. It's the longest sentence handed down so far to anyone convicted for actions surrounding the riot at the Capitol. Rhodes is one of 14 people that have been convicted of seditious conspiracy in the wake of January 6th. He's the first one to be sentenced. Rhodes' sentence was below the 25 years prosecutors had asked the court to hand down, and lower than the federal sentencing guidelines, which range from 21 to 28 years. Another Oath Keeper, Kelly Meggs, was also sentenced today to 12 years in prison for seditious conspiracy. When he was given time to speak in court, Rhodes called himself a political prisoner and said his only crime was opposing those who are, quote, destroying our country. The judge responded, calling him a threat to the very fabric of democracy. Up next, war warning. The head of a pro-Russia militia group says there could be a new revolution in Russia if Putin can't turn the tide in the war in Ukraine. Astonishing comments from Putin's so-called chef, who, by the way, prefers to be called Putin's butcher. We'll get a reality check next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. A stunning warning to Moscow today from Russian mercenary leader Yevgeniy Prigozhin. According to the Washington Post, the leader of the Wagner Group strongly and publicly criticized Russia's approach to the war in Ukraine. In an interview with a pro-war blogger, in Latvia. Prigozhin called the war a failure, saying, quote, "We are in a situation where we can simply lose Russia." He also said losses from the war could lead to an uprising from the Russian people, and he called for a totalitarian response from the government, suggesting Russia needs to, quote, "live like North Korea for a few years." Well, if your jaw was on the floor, so was mine. I'm joined now by Mike McFaul. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, current NBC News international affairs analyst, and our resident Kremlinologist. Mike, I couldn't believe what I was reading. I'm sure you felt the same way. How is this going to reverberate? This feels like if anybody else had said this about the war and they were a supposed Putin ally, I would suggest they not go on an elevator higher than a second floor or a third floor.
Well, Chuck, most certainly in my email today, there were people joking along the lines that you just described, because that most certainly can happen in this regime. These were shocking comments. It's not the first time he said these shocking things, but he continues to say them. Remember, he's the commander of the Wagner Group. They've been fighting in Bakhmut for a long time. And just think about that for a moment. He's fighting, a private army is fighting alongside or with the conventional Russian armed forces. That already has created tension between him and the Minister of Defense and the commander in charge, General Gerasimov. But now that he says this is the first time he said something threatening towards Putin. Yeah. And I'm confused by it. I want to be clear. I don't know what he's seeking to achieve with this. Analytically, I don't think he's accurate at all, but he thinks he's playing some kind of political game. I think it's a pretty dangerous one for himself.
He really took a shot at the children of the Moscow elite. I mean, he took a pretty direct shot at the defense minister. Obviously, he was referring, to an Instagram post and all of this, of essentially saying, hey, the children of Russian leaders need to be participating in this war, too. Look, it's not something, it was said in this country during Vietnam. So it's an interesting remark, but it seemed very personal and directed almost exclusively at, is it Shoigu? My apologies there for Mr.
Shoigu, yeah. Well, definitely, that was very personal. You're right. And they have a long history of animosity. Just to remind everybody, this is not the first time he's gone after Shoigu. But I just don't know if he understands his audience back home. I think he thinks that there's a lot of nationalists just like him in Russia that just are so disappointed in the way they're fighting and they want to double down. You just reminded me of Vietnam. There's another way that societies can react. It's like, hey, why are we sending our children there? Right. Maybe we need to pull out. And that's what happened in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, too. So I'm not so sure Prigozhin is so in touch with Russian society as he may believe.
So what are we to make of the Russian military right now? It turns out the Kremlin is not safe from rogue Ukrainian drones. The Kremlin has got backbiting taking place among its military leaders. This feels like a rapidly deteriorating situation politically for Putin. And I'm just curious how you think he's going to handle this.
Well, and Chuck, to add to your list, here at Stanford, when I teach about history, I talk about non-events because we don't talk about non-events in the press. We don't write books about them. But the non-event of the last 6 months was the Russian offensive. If you go back 6 or 7 months, we were all waiting for it, and it petered out in Bakhmut, and it died in Bakhmut. So you add it all up, it does not look like a pretty picture. They're now waiting for the counteroffensive. Very mysterious what happened with these groups of Russians. And I want to emphasize they were Russians that went back into Russia to liberate Russia from Putin in this town near Kharkiv, Belgorod. This does not feel like a moment where Putin feels firmly in control. And on the backdrop of that, everybody's waiting for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Yeah. If I were Vladimir Putin, I'd feel pretty nervous right now.
So, I mean, look, I don't want to, as we all know, regimes never end and then they end quickly. It's kind of like bankruptcy. You go bankrupt slowly, then quickly. But a successful Ukrainian offensive does seem to put Putin in about as weak of a position as we have ever seen him. Should we think about the unimaginable, that maybe he doesn't survive the year?
Well, we can think about it, but you're right. It's hard to predict. I do think history will record, no matter what happens in the next year, that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was the beginning of the end of Putin's regime.
Right.
Doesn't mean it's going to happen next year. May happen in 5 or 10 years. But he overreached. This has been a disaster. There's been no good outcomes. The economy's in shambles. All the economic elites think this is a complete disaster. And nobody after this war is going to say, oh, we need another Putin 2.0 to replace Putin so that we can double down on this. And I think for him, this is the beginning of the end of his regime. Whether it's him himself, I think in the long run, it's the beginning of the end.
Ambassador Mike McFaul, the criminologist that I listen to the most. Good to see you, sir. Thank you for that perspective. And thank you all for being with us this hour. We'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.